It's an election year in Australia, and as you know, voting is compulsory for everyone over the age of 18. But did you know that both these criteria weren't always the case? Voting in Australia didn't become compulsory until 1924, which meant that during the First World War, you weren't even required to vote. And at the time, the voting age was actually 21, which meant that for the roughly 38,000 men who volunteered for service between the ages of 18 and 20, you couldn't even vote for the country you were fighting for unless you came from a state that had granted voting privileges to eligible service personnel. And even then, for First Nations personnel, unless you came from a state that had already granted suffrage, volunteering for service didn't give you the vote. By 1915, compulsory voting for referendums had been introduced just in time for the 1916 reinforcement plebiscite, but state and federal elections were still optional. Now, if you weren't in the trenches, you could vote in a polling station that looked very much like the ones we have now, but if you were in the front lines, your polling booth was probably a bit more makeshift. It could have been a dugout, a tent, or even a sand dune with an officer sitting at a table recording your vote. That 1916 referendum failed, as did the 1917 one that followed it, but in also 1917, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, had lost his majority government, and this led to Australia's 7th federal election. Back then, voting wasn't preferential. It was first past the post, like the United States system, but getting ballots to the Australian Imperial Force was tricky. So as a result, a modified absentee vote was introduced, making Australia one of the first countries to allow absentee postal voting. But this ballot wasn't a list of political parties and candidates and how to vote forms like what we see today. Instead, it was a simple question. Do you want to vote for the ministerial or government candidate or the opposition candidate? If you wanted to vote for someone else, you had to know their name and write it on the form. But sadly, there was no cake stalls or democracy sausages in sight, and you had to vote on your own time. Fast forward to the Second World War, and by 1924, voting had become compulsory for all eligible voters aged 21 and over, and preferential voting had been introduced in 1918. Now, while civilians still had to wait until 21 to vote, wartime provisions extended voting rights to all eligible service personnel aged 18 and over. It wouldn't actually be until 1973 that the voting age was universally lowered to 18. The 1940 election, Australia's 16th federal election, was the first federal wartime election where voting was compulsory, and went off without much issue. Despite Robert Menzies retaining office, history repeated itself. Just like in the First World War, the man who brought us into the war wasn't the one who saw us through it. By 1941, Menzies had lost the confidence of his party and was replaced first by Arthur Fadden and then by John Curtin. The following 1943 federal election saw Curtin to a landslide victory, and he would see us through to the end of the war until he died in 1945, just weeks before the surrender was signed. By this point, service personnel were also required to vote in all elections, state, federal, and local. Whether that means you were in Australia, Egypt, London, or even a mile from the front lines in New Guinea, your vote had to be recorded. But with preferential voting now in effect, every unit now had to receive all of the relevant ballots for every electorate, overseen by an election officer who may have just been an officer of the unit, given the task due to the manpower shortages in the Electoral Commission. And while the election hasn't been called, we know it's coming. So no matter where you are, be it polling booth or sand dune, every eligible Australian has the right to have their say in how a government is organised and run, and every single vote counts. So on election day, make sure to exercise that right and pick up your democracy sausage on the way out, because let's face it, it is our greatest diplomatic export.